All right. Everybody's like ready for the weekend, I think, right? Ready for the weekend?
Finally warming up.
Yeah, right, right. After our second winter. All right, guys. All right, let's listen up. Okay, so the respiratory system. We can divide the respiratory system up into an upper respiratory system and a lower respiratory system. And so you've heard of upper respiratory infections, lower respiratory infections, right? An upper respiratory, the upper respiratory system is going to be from the larynx on up. And so the larynx is the area, there's a lot of cartilage in there, and you want to think about like where your Adam's apple is. So everywhere from there on up, that's upper respiratory. Okay, everything from the Adam's apple on down, that is the lower respiratory system. Okay. So we're going to go over some structures of each. Now, the respiratory system is basically what you're doing is bringing air you're bringing air into the lungs, because once the air gets in the lungs, the oxygen can get into your tissues or into your bloodstream, and your blood then can deliver the oxygen to your tissues. Okay. Then the tissues are going to make carbon dioxide. That's a waste product. The carbon dioxide goes back into the blood, goes back to the lungs, and then you can breathe it out. So that's really what we're doing with the respiratory system is we are getting the oxygen in and the carbon dioxide out. So here's the upper respiratory system right here. And we have, starting with the nostrils here, another name for that are the external nares. So in your notes, you're going to see external nares. In your textbook, they've changed the name just to nostrils. And then in the nasal cavity in here, this whole thing in here is the nasal cavity. It's divided into two nasal cavities by that ethmoid bone, right? That perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and that little vomer. And in there are these projections there, these bumps, and those bumps are called the nasal concha. Some people say concha, okay? But they're the nasal concha, they're just bumps. And there's three of them, so there's the superior, the middle, and the inferior concha. They are lined by a mucous membrane, so that when you are breathing in dust and particles and bacteria, the mucous membranes will secrete a mucus, and then it traps those particles, right? So you're not going to breathe that down into your lungs. The other things they do is they're like little rocks in a stream, so it slows the air down and warms the air up. So by the time that air gets down to your lungs, it's going to be clean and warm and slower, right? Then it's going to leave the nasal cavity through the internal nares. That nasal cavity narrows down, and then we call that the internal nares. Textbook again has a new word, so internal nares. All right, and then that's going to lead into your throat, and the throat is called the pharynx. The pharynx, and there's three parts to the throat. The first part of the throat here is very close to the nasal cavity, so we're going to call that the nasopharynx. Okay, so pharynx is throat, it's close to the nasal cavity, so that's the nasopharynx. The second part here is right behind the oral cavity, it's right behind your mouth, so we call that part the oropharynx. And then the third part is right on top of that cartilage area that we call the larynx. So we call that the laryngopharynx. Okay, so we divide the throat, the pharynx, up into those three parts. In the nasal cavity, at the bottom of the nasal cavity, we have the hard palate, and from behind that we have the soft palate and the uvula. We'll talk more about that in the digestive system. When the laryngopharynx gets down to the larynx area where all those cartilage are, it'll divide into two tubes. The tube posteriorly, the tube in the back, is called the esophagus. That's where your food goes down. The tube in the front, that is called the trachea. That's your windpipe. So your windpipe is more anterior, okay? And then in this larynx area, we're going to go over the cartilage that's in there. The first cartilage that we see is this cartilage here, and it acts as a kind of like a cover for the opening to the trachea. So the opening of the trachea is called the glottis, and that cartilage that'll cover it is called the epiglottis, because it covers the opening, it covers the glottis. So when you swallow, the tongue and the muscles in your throat push the epiglottis down, and it covers the trachea opening, and your food is forced to go down your esophagus, right? So that's how that's forced to go down there. So those are some of the structures in the upper respiratory system. In the lower respiratory system, and we're going to go over all of these as well. In the lower respiratory system, then, here's the larynx right here with all those pieces of cartilage we'll talk about. That's going to lead into the trachea. The trachea divides into two primary bronchi. So there's a primary, right primary bronchus and a left primary bronchus. The primary bronchi divide into secondary bronchi. And those, I think, in your new textbook are called lobar bronchi, because they're going to go to each of the lobes of the lung. And we're going to talk about how it all keeps branching after that. Right? We're going to talk about the lung. The lower respiratory system will go all the way down through the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, into the bronchioles, and all the way down to the little air sacs called alveoli. So as we go through, we're going to talk about all of that. But lower respiratory system is from the larynx on down. So if we look at some of the tissues that cover this area, this is the epithelium that covers the trachea. Do you guys recognize that epithelium? What does that look like to you? It's ciliated, so it's columnar, and it's pseudostratified. So that's pseudostratified columnar, ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So here's the cilia. Remember, the cilia acts like they move things across the surface of the cells. So they are acting like a respiratory escalator, basically. This is what it actually looks like. All those cilia look like a shag carpet. Okay? And they are constantly moving the mucus and the dust and the particles back up your trachea so that you can cough it out, swallow it down, just get it out of the trachea. Okay. These are the cartilages that are in your larynx area. Okay, and so we have a model that looks just like this. The Adam's apple, this is the thyroid cartilage. So the thyroid cartilage is called, that's the Adam's apple. Okay. And then right below that is another cartilage that's called the cricoid cartilage. And then below the cricoid cartilage starts the trachea. And there's other cartilages around the trachea. We got the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, and then up here is the epiglottis. Right? Now, if we look at the back side of of that larynx area, we can see the thyroid cartilage again. And it doesn't really have a back to it, so it's really just a shield on the front of your throat. And then the cricoid cartilage does go all the way around, and it's actually a little bit wider on the back. And then there's the epiglottis. Okay, so the epiglottis closes over the opening, so it's going to close over the opening going into the trachea. There's also a whole bunch of other ligaments in here. Those are your vocal ligaments, and we're not going to go over those individually. You just need to know collectively those are your vocal cords or your vocal ligaments in that area. So then right below the cricoid cartilage starts the trachea. And the trachea has several rings around it. It's about, it's about 4 to 6 inches long, and it has a lot of rings on it. The rings are open in the back. So if we look at the back, we can see that there are C-shaped rings that are open in the back, And that's because what sits right behind here is the esophagus. And what goes down the esophagus? Food, right? So when you have big, bulky food going down that esophagus, you want it to be able to expand a little bit. So it's going to expand into that trachea area, okay? And not get lodged in the esophagus. Okay, then here's a picture just showing that glottis. The glottis is the opening into the trachea. Just showing it open. Okay, there it's open, and then it'll close as well for sound, to produce sound. Okay, so there's the closed and there's the open. All right, now boys, when they reach puberty, testosterone makes those vocal cords thicker, right? And then their voice drops. That's what causes it to drop lower. All right, so here's our trachea then, and we can see it's going to go all the way down and divide into two primary bronchi. So you'll have to name the left primary bronchus and the right primary bronchus on your lab exam. And then the primary bronchi divide into the secondary bronchi. So we're going to see that the right lung has 3 lobes to it, so it'll have 3 secondary bronchi. The left lung has only 2 lobes to it, so there will be only 2 secondary bronchi. And again, in your book, they call them lobar, not secondary. All right, so here we can see the divisions. This is one of the diagrams that will be on your lab exam, because you can see the primary bronchus divides into the secondary bronchi, and then the secondary bronchus will divide into these tertiary bronchi, which in your new book is segmental bronchi. And then the tertiary bronchi will divide into bronchioles. So for the test taking, I'm going to stick with the old terminology, which goes from primary to secondary to tertiary bronchi, and then it goes down to the bronchioles, just so you know. All right, and so then the bronchioles, we can look at, there's 2 different types of bronchioles. There's a terminal bronchiole, and then there's a respiratory bronchiole. And I just want you to see, as we're coming down from the primary bronchus to the secondary bronchus to the tertiary bronchus, we see that cartilage starting to break up. So instead of having this C-shaped ring that we had in the trachea, it starts to break up, and it actually starts to look more like a giraffe's neck, right? And by the time we get down to the bronchioles, the reason why we call them bronchioles is because there's no longer any cartilage on them. Okay, there's no cartilage on them. And the first type of bronchiole is called a terminal bronchiole, and the second type is called a respiratory bronchiole. The respiratory bronchioles have little air sacs attached to them, so they have little alveoli attached to them. Those are little air sacs. The terminal bronchiole do not have air sacs. The respiratory bronchioles do have air sacs. So that's why we name them that way. And then at the very end, we have the lobes of alveoli. So there's lobes of these air sacs that are called alveoli. Okay, so that's how we get the air down. This is a conducting system. We're going to conduct the air all the way down until we get to the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar alveoli. And once we're there, now this is actually where air is going to get exchanged. So this is more of a, instead of conducting, that's more of the respiratory portion. We're actually going to have gases exchanged. Let's take a look here then and look at the structure of the alveoli a little bit bigger. This, of course, is your bronchiole right there. So there's a terminal bronchiole. And then here we see the respiratory bronchiole because we see these alveoli. So the alveoli are attached to it. And then you can see a lobule of all those alveoli. And if we look around the alveoli, there's a couple of things that are surrounding the alveoli. First of all, there are these bands of elastic fibers surrounding them. Okay, so you can kind of see some bands of elastic fibers. That's because once you get the air all the way down into those little alveoli, the alveoli are going to expand. And then when you want to expire and you want to breathe that out, those rubber bands are going to help to bring those alveoli, kind of compress them a little bit to force the air out. right? So there are some diseases that will actually damage those elastic fibers. So when you get into pathophysiology and things like that, you're going to learn about diseases like emphysema and some other diseases where you actually damage the elastic fibers and they can't compress. Okay. There's also surrounding them, if we look, we can see blood vessels, and those are little capillaries. So the blood vessel coming to the lungs from the heart is called the what? Pulmonary artery. So here we have our pulmonary artery, and it branches and branches and branches into the little capillaries, and the capillaries all surround each one of those little alveoli. And when they're there, they're picking up what? Oxygen. So that blue blood, that deoxygenated blood, then becomes red, and then all those capillaries are going to merge back together to form the smallest of the veins, which is called a venule. And then that's going to go back to the left atrium, right? So we can see the blood vessels. We can see the pulmonary artery coming down, branching into the capillaries, and then merging back together and forming that pulmonary vein. So while those capillaries are surrounding those alveoli, they're picking up oxygen. Okay, the capillaries are picking up oxygen from the alveoli. Okay? All right, now, where they touch, where the capillary touches the alveoli, that's called the respiratory membrane. It's the respiratory membrane. And we'll show you this picture here. I guess that's as big as we're going to get it. Not as big as it used to be. So this is an alveolus. It's one alveolus, right? And we can see that it's made of simple squamous cells. And there's some other cells that surround it, like here's an alveolar macrophage. A macrophage does what? It eats. It's engulfing things. So, and because it's a resident of the lungs, it's called an alveolar macrophage. There's some other cells in there that are also going to help with the immune system. But you can see the blood vessels here too. Here's the little capillaries where they're touching the alveolus. So right where the capillary touches the alveolus, that's the respiratory membrane. So that's where the exchange of gases can go through. Anywhere they touch, anywhere a capillary touches an alveolus is called the respiratory membrane. Oh, there's a bigger picture. All right, so right here is a respiratory membrane. Right here is a respiratory membrane. Anywhere they touch, that's where the respiratory membrane is. So if we take a look at the respiratory membrane, this is basically what we're seeing. So up on top here, this is the capillary. Down at the bottom, this is the alveolus. So here's one, this is a simple squamous cell, right? And then this is the simple squamous cell too. And then in between the two, this is the simple squamous from the alveolus, this is the simple squamous from the capillary. In between the two is a basement membrane. So those three things right there together, that forms the respiratory membrane. Oxygen is going to move from the alveolus into the blood and then into the red blood cells so that that can be delivered to tissues. Carbon dioxide is going to move from the blood across that respiratory membrane into the alveolus so that we can breathe it out. Right? So that's going to be important. We're going to go over how that works. It works based on pressures, and we'll talk about that next time we meet. The other thing that I want you to see is there's this blue line in here of this oily substance that's called surfactant. So surfactant is on the inside of the alveoli, and they produce like a surface tension so that the alveolus doesn't collapse, right? Because it's got these elastic bands around it that are trying to collapse it. The surfactant creates a surface tension so it doesn't collapse. So we know babies that are born prematurely, they don't have this surfactant being produced. So they have to be given a gas with surfactant in it so that their little alveoli stay open and don't collapse. Okay. And then I'm just going to go into the lungs, and then that'll be it for today, and then we'll pick it up again next week. So we have the left lung and the right lung. If we look at the left lung, we see there's a notch here in it. So the left lung's a little smaller than the right lung. We call that notch the cardiac notch. Okay, because why? Because that's where the heart sits. The heart sits off to the left side a little bit, right? So we've got this little notch. that gives us only enough room for 2 lobes in the left lung. We have a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. They're divided by a fissure that's called the oblique fissure. Okay? It's called the oblique fissure. If we look at the right lung has an inferior lobe, and that superior lobe is kind of divided in half. And the upper part is called the superior lobe, and the lower part is called the middle lobe. So we added a little bit of more lung, and it's separated out into 3 lobes. So we still have that oblique fissure that would separate the inferior and superior lobe, but then there's also a horizontal fissure that separates the superior lobe and the middle lobe. Now, if we look at the medial side of the lungs, facing into the mediastinum, there's an area in there that's called the hilum, and the hilum is where all of the blood vessels come in, and then those primary bronchi come in. So that's called the hilum. And when you look at it, the pulmonary artery is always on top, and then underneath that we see the pulmonary veins and the primary bronchus. Okay, so there's 2 pulmonary veins, 1 pulmonary artery, 1 bronchus, all in that hilum area. Okay. Any questions on this? Kind of gives us all the anatomy that we need to get started. When we meet next week, we'll start talking about the physiology, right?